The United Nations says an international staff member has been killed and 5 others wounded in an explosion in Gaza. The Israeli military has denied attacking a UN building. According to Palestinian health officials, more than 900 people have been killed since Israel resumed attacking Gaza this week. Now, thousands of Israelis have protested the new strikes, saying that the return of fighting puts the lives of the hostages held by Hamas in danger. Protesters around the world, including in New York, Paris, and Chile, have also condemned the attacks. Now, Israel has refused to start talks on the second phase of the ceasefire deal it signed with Hamas back in January. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the latest strikes were just the beginning.
From now on, Israel will act against Hamas with increasing force. And from now on, negotiations will only take place under fire. Hamas has already felt the weight of our force in the last 24 hours. And I want to assure you and them, this is only the beginning.
And meanwhile, governments in the Middle East, in Europe, and other countries are urging an end to the war.
We are witnessing a situation in which we had an intolerable level of suffering for the Palestinian people with the air raids that killed hundreds of people. We have humanitarian aid still blocked. And I believe that the role of the UN is to do everything to convince the parties and to have the international community pressing for 3 essential aspects. First, for the ceasefire to be fully respected. Second, for humanitarian aid to have access to Gaza in an unimpeded way. And third, for the unconditional release of hostages. And we will not give up on these objectives.
We are deeply concerned about the civilian casualties in Gaza now the fighting has resumed there. Our particular concern in Germany is, of course, for the remaining hostages. And the largest group among them are German-Israeli dual nationals. My clear call to Hamas remains, finally release the hostages. It is important to talk about the political future of the Gaza Strip as a whole. The Arab League's plan offers a good basis for this.
The civilian casualties from Israeli strikes overnight are appalling. I want to be clear. A return to fighting will only result in the deaths of more Palestinian civilians, Israeli hostages, and IDF soldiers. This conflict cannot be resolved through military means. We want to see the ceasefire re-established as soon as possible.
This is a déjà vu. Once again, Israel has violated the peace accord, ceasefire agreement. Of course, we strongly condemn that, and we urge the Security Council to take further action.
Let's get some more reaction from Gershon Baskin, an Israeli peace activist and author, Middle East director of the International Communities Organization, and also someone who has worked providing a back channel for negotiations with Hamas for 18 years. Thank you so much for joining us on DW. We are now seeing a return to full war in Gaza. In your view, how much of this is about Israeli military strategy versus domestic political concerns of the Netanyahu government?
Well, it's obviously a combination of the two, but I think it's mostly led by the political needs of Prime Minister Netanyahu to stay in power. There is no military strategy which brings about the total victory that Netanyahu has talked about, and the return to the active warfare endangers the lives of the hostages. It is a strategy which cannot succeed. The only way of eliminating Hamas as a force that controls Gaza, both a political force and a military force, is by providing a political alternative to Hamas. And this is something that the Netanyahu government has refused to do.
So failing having provided a political alternative to Hamas, this initial hostage deal, the ceasefire deal with Hamas, did seem to have some momentum behind it, but the second phase then collapsed quite quickly. Did it ever stand a chance of holding up?
I don't think so. I mean, Hamas made a big compromise by entering into phase one of the deal at the pressing of President Trump and his envoy Steve Witkoff. But Hamas's compromise was that they knew that in phase two the war would end, and Israel obligated itself to enter into negotiations on phase two by day 16 to be concluded by day 30 of a 42-day first period. Israel never had the intention of beginning those negotiations or ending those negotiations because Prime Minister Netanyahu refuses to end the war, which is the requirement of phase two, to end the war, to withdraw from Gaza. Hamas would be required to release all the hostages, but there needs to be a political day after in Gaza where Hamas doesn't control Gaza either militarily or governmentally, and that's not on the table.
Yeah, how does that make you feel when you look at the current situation this far into the war?
Well, I think what's happening in Israel on the streets today is an indication of what the Israeli public is feeling. There are reported more than 100,000 Israelis on the streets of Jerusalem today and much more around the country. And these demonstrations are increasing in their intensity and in their anger of the Israeli public who don't want this war to be renewed, who want the hostages home. And Netanyahu is combining the war effort and the excuse of going back to war with the renewal of the judicial overhaul, of passing laws that are against the democracy of Israel and trying to fire the head of the Shin Bet and the Attorney General. These are the gatekeepers of Israeli democracy. So we're having a combination of issues that are bringing the Israeli public to maybe a breaking point where they will no longer tolerate what's been going on for way too long.
Do you think that's realistic, that we could be seeing the kind of momentum within Israeli society to reach that breaking point and fundamentally change Israeli domestic politics?
It's very difficult to know what's happening. Israeli society is exhausted by the trauma of October 7th and everything that's happened since, the pain of the 59 hostages that remain in Gaza. Many of the Israelis who supported the peace process in the past are in despair because they know that at the end of the war, they're going to remain 7 million Palestinian Arabs and 7 million Israeli Jews on the land between the river and the sea. And no one has a solution of how to deal with that. We know what the solution is. It's a political solution of the two states, but we have no political leadership to drive us in that direction after the traumas that we've experienced over the last year and a half.
I'm curious who you think might have Prime Minister Netanyahu's ear on this. Is there a certain group or person who would be well positioned to make that case?
There is one person in the world who has any leverage over Netanyahu, and that's Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And we thought that Donald Trump might actually, for a short period, we thought that he might actually carry through with what he said when he was inaugurated, that he would bring an end to the wars. But apparently he gave a green light to Israel to renew the war now. And we're very disappointed that he and his envoy did not find a way of making the ceasefire sustainable and permanent and leading to the release of the Israeli hostages and the end of the war in Gaza.
Now, I do also want to ask you for some perspective on where all of this leaves Hamas, based on your extensive experience speaking with them. Given your work negotiating, do you think there is now any room for them to hold renewed dialogue with the Israelis?
No, there won't be renewed dialogue with the Israelis, but there is dialogue within Hamas, mainly within the Hamas leadership outside of Gaza. The problem that we're facing is that there is no political leadership of Hamas left in Gaza. The Hamas people running the show in Gaza today are second, third tier level of their military command, and they're not people with the political oversight or the long view of Hamas's role in the future of Palestine. So we do have debates going on in the Hamas leadership outside, but they may actually lose control of what's going on inside of Gaza, particularly as the war increases in its intensity. There might be a break between these two forces, and then they're really stuck because it's the Hamas leadership outside that's been willing to negotiate some kind of deals, albeit not a peace deal with Israel, but at least a deal to release the hostages, and looking at their own future, perhaps becoming a political movement and not an armed militia.
So in your view, what are the possible steps forward here in order to find something constructive coming out of this? Is there
Seeing as how that President Trump apparently is not going to save us from ourselves, it's really on the Israeli society now to send the message to Netanyahu that he can't continue to go in the direction that he's going, that we don't want this war, we want the hostages home, and we want a political solution to this conflict. Even if the Israeli public is not saying that out loud now, that's what will emerge in the months to come.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on DW News. We've been speaking with Gershon Baskin, an Israeli peace activist.
Thank you.
Let's take a closer look at the situation in Gaza now with Olga Cherevko, a spokesperson for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. She's joining us today from Al-Mawasi in Gaza. First, we are just getting some news coming in. I'd like to ask you about, if you can comment, an update on your colleagues. We've just heard from the Gaza Health Ministry that 6 foreign UN workers have been injured in an Israeli strike. Do you have any update on their condition?
Thanks, Claire, for having me. We have heard the same extremely concerning and extremely disturbing reports. Unfortunately, we're still gathering the details, and we will know more, hopefully, in the coming minutes and hours.
Well, I did want to also ask you about the fighting that has resumed, also the fact that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying that Israel's airstrikes are only the beginning. What does that actually look like for the humanitarian situation in Gaza where you are?
It's been a very tense and volatile 2 days. The strikes continued through last night. And of course, we've all seen the disturbing and shocking footage of people, hundreds of people having been killed and injured that have been reported. And this is, of course, the nightmare scenario that we have been trying to avoid and hoping to avoid at all costs. And it is seems to be unfolding in front of our eyes. This, of course, also comes on top of more than 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks now, since the crossings for the entry of all cargo have been closed.
Indeed, we heard your colleague just there saying that Israel's latest blockade of aid will be disastrous. Exactly what does that look like? Can you tell us in details how it affects your work?
Absolutely. So during the weeks of the ceasefire, it was an opportunity that we finally gained, that we had been asking for, to be able to scale up the assistance and to deliver life-saving aid to the people that were recovering from 15 months of relentless violence. We managed to deliver food, to increase our water delivery points and water production, to increase our medical facilities, and provide shelter and all these life critical items. When the crossings closed, of course, this means that we've had to ration our assistance, to reprioritize how we deliver, and reduce some of the assistance packages to make them stretch longer and reach as many people as possible. And I want to make it clear that every day that goes by with these crossings being closed for the entry of aid, it increases the undoing of all the progress that we managed to achieve during these weeks of the ceasefire.
And how is that further complicated now, just the act of delivering aid without a ceasefire in place anymore?
I mean, what we've always said is that we absolutely cannot accept going back to the pre-ceasefire scenario and dealing with these draconian restrictions on our movement. And we've spent, before the ceasefire, we spent so many hours waiting for green lights and waiting to go and waiting to move, and moved in extremely uncertain and insecure environment. And we cannot have this return. Of course, since the attacks restarted 2 days ago, we've had to suspend some of our operations. We are continuing response as much as we possibly can. But the security right now we'll have to see how and when we can restart the ones that have been suspended. But of course, this is just a very complicated situation, and we are trying to get more clarity, including on our movement modalities in the future.
Well, thank you so much for making the time to speak with us on DW. That is Olga Cherevko, a spokesperson for the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Gaza.
Thank you.